can turn off your camera, okay? And also, if you don't want to be recorded, and still you have the right to leave the presentation, and you can view it online, okay? So that's just some housekeeping rules, okay? So here we are very happy to have Pablo Liboreiro as our speaker. Sorry, I cannot speak the Spanish well, but I'm very happy to have Pablo here. So Pablo is an assistant professor at the Technical University of Madrid. His research focuses on economic development and input-output analysis. So he wrote some recent articles on the drivers of deindustrialization in advanced economies. He is currently working on how to inquiry economic development topics by means of general equilibrium input-output models. So today, Pablo will present his Leontief Prize winning research on the application of nonlinear input-output analysis to estimate discrete unemployment in less developed countries. The presentation will reflect the basic ingredients of the model as well as the mean estimation result. Likewise, the typical problems that arise in nonlinear input-output analysis will be covered, as well as some of the possible future development. So his presentation will be about 30 minutes and will be followed with the Q&A for 15 to 20 minutes. So for the Q&A session will not be recorded. Only the presentation session will be recorded. Pablo, the floor is yours. Thank you for presenting today.
Well, hello. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Kishuam for his great patience and attention so that we can hold this seminar in a convenient way for everyone. I would also like to thank the International Input-Output Association for the attention they have paid to my work, attention for which I am deeply honored. Thirdly, I would like to warn you that my ability to speak English is far from what is required to have a fluent conversation on any topic, so please be patient during the lecture and especially during the question time. Well, having made all these warnings and thanks, I will proceed to present the contents of my lecture. I would like this talk to be a consideration on the methods and applications of nonlinear input-output analysis, taking as an instance of it my award-winning article, which consists of an estimate of disguised unemployment in major middle-income countries. To do this, I will emphasize the process of making up the paper, that is, how the idea came about, what problems arose, and how they were solved. After this, I will present the main results of the estimate itself, and finally, I will end by stating what I think are the pros and cons of nonlinear input-output analysis. So the award-winning paper arose from an early investigation in which I began to use data from countries such as India, China, and so on. And then I realized that in these countries, there was a huge difference between the productivity of workers in different sectors, much greater than what exists in developed countries. These productivity differences are reflected in turn in large wage differences between workers with apparently the same skills. Actually, it seemed proven that the lower the country's per capita income, the larger the wage difference between the sectors. That is precisely what this figure shows, which plots the relative wage of the best paid industrial sectors, such as chemical products or electric power, over that of the lowest paid sectors, such as agriculture or retail trade, as a function of per capita income. Thus, it is observed that while in the United States, a worker employed in a large industry earns twice as much as a farmer, in India, he or she earns 8 times more. So looking at data like this, John Robinson's disguised unemployment hypothesis came to my mind. According to this hypothesis, in a developing industrial society, underemployment of labor does not always take the form of open unemployment, but also the form of disguised unemployment. This is so because in a society of this kind, there is no full mobility of labor, and in addition, there is no regular system of unemployment benefits. Therefore, any worker who cannot find a regular job in the major industries to which trade unions control access will have to find employment in any unregulated occupation where wages are set in according to market clearing prices. Since many workers are in this situation, the relative wages of unregulated occupations will be abnormally low, giving rise to a situation of disguised unemployment, meaning that the differences in the marginal product of two workers with the same skills is greater than the differences in the marginal disutility of their tasks. In the event that perfect competition prevails among producers, this is the same as saying that there are workers who are paid lower wages than others despite having the same skills. That is why John Robinson stated that disguised unemployment may be regarded as a special case of a change in relative wages. So John Robinson's hypothesis naturally had many further developments, and it gave rise to intense debate among scholars around questions such as the role of surplus labor in economic employment or the nature of informal employment. However, despite this, there have not been many attempts to estimate the amount of disguised unemployment under these assumptions. Specifically, reviewing the literature, I found that today there are only 2 works that assumed this hypothesis in order to estimate disguised unemployment by means of input-output analysis. They are the article by Morishima and Murata estimating disguised unemployment in Japan in the 50s and 60s, and the article by Goyas and Hernandez estimating disguised unemployment in Mexico in the 80s. Actually, this latter closely follows the former, so it can be considered that to date there is really only one proposal to estimate disguised unemployment by means of input-output analysis. Having noted this lack of research, it seemed appropriate to carry out a new estimate, taking into account most recent data and considering an alternative input-output framework to the one stated by Morishima and Murata. It is not that their model is not okay, but they started from some assumptions that are somewhat different from those that John Robinson had in mind. And I found interesting to try to do something as close as possible to the assumptions of the original proposal. Specifically, in her writings, John Robinson assumes that differences in marginal productivity across sectors are mainly due to differences in the volume of employment, assuming a given state of organization, equipment, and techniques. This implies assuming diminishing returns to scale in employment of labor. So I noticed that Professor Guerra and Professor Sancho, in a 2014 article, had specified an extension of Leontief's model in which it was possible to consider diminishing returns to scale in the use of production inputs. However, when I analyzed their model, I noticed a common problem in non-linear input-output analysis, the so-called multicollinearity problem. That is, it often happens that there is a large number of parameters to be estimated from a relatively small number of observations. This is a huge problem, and it stalled my research for several weeks to the point that I was about to give it up. However, in reviewing the literature, I noticed that Professor Fernandez Vázquez, in a 2015 paper, estimated all the parameters of the extended Leontief function by means of econometric techniques using the input-output tables for several years of the Spanish Academy. And he found that, relatively speaking, there were constant returns to scale in the use of all inputs except labor. Actually, there are several reasons to consider this is a plausible scenario. This is a plausible case, especially when changes in the short period are regarded. Indeed, it is to be expected that as less suitable labor is employed, the labor cost per unit of output will rise as the average efficiency of the labor employed declines. Furthermore, if a given state of equipment were considered, which is not the case in my paper, it might be expected that such equipment could need the same intermediate inputs per unit of output to run, but it could become less and less adapted to employ the available labor. So, therefore, I decided to assume an extended Leontief production function in the style of Professor Guerra and Sancho, but assuming that the results obtained by Professor Fernandez Vázquez could be considered very general. In this way, the number of parameters to be estimated was drastically reduced, and the multicollinearity problem was left aside. However, the problems did not end here. In the context of nonlinear analysis, unlike in the context of linear analysis, the price system and the quantity system cannot be considered to be independent. In the present case, prices are an increasing function of the volume of output. Then it is necessary to make some additional assumptions about how demand behaves in the face of price changes, what the numeraire is, and so on. Besides, the resulting system of equations is a nonlinear system, so it's necessary to formulate an algorithm that allows its numerical resolution. Specifically, for the present case, it was assumed that consumer preferences can be represented by a system of linear expenditures dependent only on the level of income and on prices. That public spending, investment and exports can be assumed as independent variables, and that wages in major industries can be taken as numeraire. Then all the fundamental equations of the systems can be summarized in a single system of nonlinear equations, which can be solved by means of a Newton algorithm. So by means of this nonlinear model, disguised unemployment is estimated assuming that this is a special case of a change in relative wages. Thus, first the model is calibrated so that if actual relative wages are considered, then the actual employment or the actual amount of employment result as it appears in each country statistics. Second, a relative wage structure is chosen that can be considered to be non-dualistic. In the present case, the wage structure of the United States was chosen. Then the relative wage structure is changed, while keeping all other variables constant in terms of the wage unit, in terms of the numeraire. In this way, another volume of employment results, which can be called non-dualistic employment. So disguised unemployment is roughly calculated as the difference between actual employment and non-dualistic employment. Thus, the estimate made is equivalent to asking how many laborers would have to be withdrawn from the labor market for relative wages to change, assuming that everything else remains the same in terms of the wage unit. Obviously, this is not a very plausible scenario, but it allows us to estimate the disguised unemployment in each country according to John Robinson's assumptions, and with it obtain some stylized facts. Before highlighting these stylized facts, it's interesting to comment on some features of this counterfactual scenario. So it results that for wages to change, a large amount of laborers would have to leave the market under the assumptions made. But this great shortening of labor would not lead to such a large reduction of output, so the average productivity of the remaining workers would increase. This is what this figure shows. Specifically, the figure shows the difference between actual and counterfactual employment, and the difference between actual and counterfactual output, both in relation to actual values. And it is observed that the difference in employment is always greater than the difference in output in all the countries of the sample. This is the result of the seemingly very low marginal productivity of a large part of the laborers in these countries. Furthermore, wages would rise more than prices in all countries of the sample, as it showed this figure, where both the counterfactual price level with respect of its actual value and counterfactual wages with respect of actual wages are plotted. So this result is a necessary consequence of the assumption that the low marginal productivity is due to the large volume of employment in some sectors, and of the assumption that in these unregulated sectors, wages are setting according to market clearing prices. As a consequence of all this, the share of labor in income would increase in all countries of the sample. This can be shown in this figure, where both the actual labor share and the counterfactual labor share are represented for all the countries in the sample. Then, according to the assumptions of the model, it is noted that the shortening of labor necessary for wages to change would imply a higher level of domestic prices, a higher level of productivity, and a less unequal distribution of income, although it could also imply a decrease in aggregate output and income. These are plausible results, although they hardly represent any real scenario. So the interesting exercise at this point is to test to what extent the results are consistent with some developments in the literature according to John Robinson's hypothesis. In particular, some quite remarkable stylized facts can be observed. In the first place, it is observed that there is a high correlation between disguised unemployment and per capita income. Specifically, it is observed that lower middle income countries such as India or Indonesia seems to have a large part of their labor disguisedly unemployed, while in upper middle income countries such as Turkey or Russia, this kind of unemployment seems to be lower. It is also observed that as countries develop, the disguised unemployment rate decreases. In this sense, the cases of India, China, and Russia stand out. Countries in which the underemployment of labor seems to have been significantly reduced during the period considered. On the other hand, there also seems to be a high correlation between the form that labor underemployment takes and the country's per capita income. Thus, in countries like Turkey, underemployment of labor results in both disguised and open unemployment, while in countries like India, open unemployment seems to represent only a small part of the underemployed labor. Somehow, the lower the country's income, the less adequate seems to be the open unemployment rate to estimate its underemployed labor. Finally, there also seems to be a high correlation between the sector distribution of disguised unemployment and per capita income. Specifically, it's found that most of the underemployed labor in lower middle income countries like India and Indonesia seems to be disguised agricultural unemployment. That is, in these countries, agriculture seems to be the main reservoir of disguised unemployment. By contrast, in upper middle income countries like Turkey and Russia, the disguised unemployment reservoirs consist of urban occupations such as retail, trade, or construction. Thus, it seems that as countries develop, a portion of the rural-urban migration ends up resulting in an increase in urban underemployment, since major industries are unable of absorbing as much labor, because wages in these industries are set by institutional criteria above market clearing prices. Actually, many of these stylized facts are not new and could have been obtained in some other way. Indeed, once it is assumed that disguised unemployment is a special case of a change in relative wages, many of these regularities could follow immediately. So, for example, instead of all these nonlinear input-output workout, some index of wage dispersion could have been constructed, and using econometric tools, disguised unemployment could also have been estimated. Possibly this route is not only shorter, but also less painful. However, I think that input-output analysis has several advantages over alternative methods based on econometrics. In the first place, the result of the estimate made are rigorously derived from both data and the assumptions of the models. So there is no room for tricks, so to speak. Secondly, input-output formalization makes it possible to evince the assumptions and biases of the estimate, avoiding incurring inadvertent biases. Actually, once a model is specified, all its biases are explicit in their assumptions, so they can be identified. And third, estimating disguised unemployment by means of nonlinear input-output analysis seems the natural way to do the estimate, since the very existence of disguised unemployment implies a context of several industries. For these reasons, I think that nonlinear input-output analysis is a better option than others based on econometric techniques. This point can lead us to wonder about the pros and cons of nonlinear input-output analysis, and with this I would like to end my presentation. However, before setting out the pros and cons of nonlinear input-output analysis, I would like to formulate a definition of it. I think that nonlinear input-output analysis can be defined as the analysis of input-output tables in which it is assumed that there are non-constant returns to scale in the use of some inputs, or there are input substitution phenomena, or both. Therefore, in nonlinear input-output analysis, the price system cannot be solved independently of the quantity system, but both must be solved together. In this sense, I consider a nonlinear input-output model and a price endogenized input-output model to be synonymous. Obviously, taking into account non-constant returns to scale as well as input substitution gives nonlinear input-output analysis certain advantages over nonlinear input-output over linear input-output analysis. Among them, I would like to point out at least two. On the one hand, as long as the connection between prices and quantities is considered, more plausible estimates can be obtained when estimating the effects of changes, especially in the short period. With this, for example, main impact analysis can be improved since more realistic multipliers could be obtained. On the other hand, nonlinear input-output analysis allows the study of new phenomena hardly tractable with linear input-output analysis. Among many others, the following could be highlighted. Phenomena in which changes in quantities led to changes in the distribution of income. This is the typical case of rents and quasi-rents, hardly tractable with linear input-output analysis, or also situations such as demand-led inflation, which is necessary to consider the relationship between prices and quantities, and also issues related to economic development, such as industrial dualism, where returns to scale and elasticity of substitution are assumed to vary across sectors, leading to distortions in income distribution, and many more. Actually, there are many phenomena that can be investigated when considering models with endogenous prices within the input-output analysis. However, this approach also has many cons that should put off any reasonable person. In the present case, I would like to mention three serious drawbacks of nonlinear input-output analysis. First of all, the multicollinearity problem already mentioned. This is a serious problem since nonlinear production functions, taking into account all the intermediate inputs, often imply large number of parameters to be estimated from a relatively small number of observations. However, I think that it is possible to solve this problem by making, for example, plausible assumptions. This may be one of the contributions of my paper, indeed. Alternatively, econometric methods can also be used, as Professor Fernandez Vázquez did. In addition to this problem, there is another much bigger one, the algorithm problem. That is the need to formulate an algorithm to solve the system of nonlinear equations. And I say algorithm because since the analysis is nonlinear, the resulting system of equations is also nonlinear. So this is a huge problem of nonlinear input-output analysis, and the one that makes it not always worthwhile to opt for this framework. For example, let us imagine that we want to estimate which are the sectors most affected by a given spending policy. We can apply the standard Leontief analysis, which is currently very refined, and find plausible figures, although probably not very exact, or we can opt for a nonlinear framework, specifying a difficult-to-solve model and designing an algorithm for its resolution. Probably by this second route, we will end up obtaining figures that are more exact, but they may not provide much more information. This is where the sensitivity problem comes into play. Every estimate requires assumptions, and it is thus relevant to know how sensitive the outcomes are to the assumptions. That is, do different assumptions change the outcomes very much or not? In the present case, is the information provided by nonlinear analysis so different from other more standardized methods as to assume all of its cons? That's the question and also the challenge for future research. However, as Aesop's fable says, hic Rhodus, hic salta, here is Rose, dance here. With this I end my lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you for your interesting presentation. So now we stop recording. So the next section